We're here with Norman Roule. He just retired from the CIA in October, managing several projects in the Middle East and Iran. He's now a senior advisor to the counter-extremism project United Against Nuclear Iran. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Kevin.
I would like to play for you a clip that UN Ambassador Nikki Haley said before the United Nations just the other day about that vote. Take a listen.
But this vote will make a difference on how Americans look at the UN and on how we look at countries who disrespect us in the UN. And this vote will be remembered.
So, Mr. Roule, the majority of nations, including every nation on the UN Security Council, had voted against or denounced, really, the President Trump's decision to move the U.S. Embassy in Israel. What do you make of what's happened this week with the United Nations?
Well, it's been an extraordinary development. We've not had any situation like this in the past. I think the challenge is that it now shifts the debate and the subject of the debate to the United States and the United States political making decisions. I think it's more important and more useful if we can keep the focus of the conversation on the peace process and on Iran and on the issues that underlie extremism in the Middle East.
I want to talk about Iran in a second, but staying with Israel in particular, with President Trump's decision to do that, of course it was applauded by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as many conservative groups. It did get some criticism from Democrats, even Democrats who support Israel. Do you think it did anything at all to jeopardize peace talks and the parameters of such peace talks?
I think it certainly complicated the parameters of the peace talks. I think it makes it more difficult for some of our partners in such talks, such as the Saudis or the Emiratis or other regional players or the Egyptians to as easily play a role in those discussions. But I think the peace talks in the end will depend upon what the framework of the deal ultimately is. And we've not seen that.
Saudi Arabia, one of the countries voting against the United States on that referendum. Do you think UN Ambassador Nikki Haley has done a sufficient job in representing the United States interests at the UN?
Ambassador Haley does an exceptional job in representing the administration's positions at the United Nations.
All right, switching gears now to Saudi Arabia. In particular, it has been a busy week or a busy month rather, with regards to the situation and the relationship they have with Yemen. What do you make of this administration's response regarding that missile attack, I believe on December 19th, to the royal palace in Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think you have a couple of issues at play here. First, the administration has put forward a very compelling case that Iran has been behind some aspect of the missile firings from Yemen on Saudi Arabia. I should point out that those firings also take place against the multinational community that lives in Saudi Arabia. There are thousands of Americans who are placed at risk by these shots. At this point, the Iranian-supported Houthi allies have conducted another launch. This is a test of the international community. If we allow the second shot to go by without some sort of concerted international action, we may encourage the Houthis and their Iranian allies to take further steps, believing that they have not yet reached a red line for the international community.
With regards to the ports in Yemen, there was a bipartisan letter that was sent to the leaders of Saudi Arabia in order to, yes, continue to help with humanitarian efforts in Yemen, but also to reopen some ports. What role is Iran playing with regards to those ports that are still closed in Yemen?
Well, the opening of the ports is an important development. The humanitarian tragedy in Yemen is of a vast scale, even in terms of all of the violence and suffering we've seen in the Middle East in recent years. Iran has been accused of providing weapons and personnel for the Yemeni conflict. I think if I were in Saudi Arabia, I would be concerned that the ports could be used by Iran to deliver the weapons and, again, the technical personnel to offer those weapons. Likewise, the unfettered flow of aid into the country could enable the Houthis to dominate how that aid is delivered, to charge for it, to provide it to its allies, to deny it to its opponents. So I think it's a good thing that the ports are opened. I think it's important that the United Nations monitor this. And I think it's very important that every step be taken to deny Iran a capacity to use those shipments to introduce weapons and personnel into Yemen.
President Trump's talked a lot about renegotiating a nuclear agreement or ripping up the agreement with Iran. We haven't heard as much publicly, probably more privately, about the port issue. Do you think that President Trump and this administration, Secretary Tillerson, have done a sufficient job on the global stage with regards to Iran?
Well, I think the recent months have seen a growing dialogue between the administration and our European partners on Iran. I think the administration's national security strategy very appropriately highlights the role of partners in such a program against Iran. I think it's moving in the right direction. And I know that the national security staff and the other personnel behind that strategy worked very hard and very long to develop a strategy they believe would be effective.
We got less than a minute left. Biggest thing on your radar in the first quarter of next year in the Middle East?
I would worry about a missile shot from Yemen that strikes a target in Saudi Arabia of such economic or political consequence that would require a dramatic action by the Saudis. A similar occurrence perhaps for the United Arab Emirates. I would worry about an uptick of violence relating to the peace process, or perhaps some sort of a degradation of the situation in Libya because of the inflow of ISIS personnel.